we're talking about the medical heritage of ancient India. I'll show you that we had the most ancient medical systems in the world, impacting every civilization of the world. So, in the hermeneutics of Ayurveda, Surendranath Dasgupta, he says medicine was the most important of physical sciences. It was intimately connected with Samkhya and Vaisheshika physics. It's the origin of logical statements encoded in Nyaya Sutra. Everything needs a killer application, right? Once you have a killer application, then your thinking is very clear. And he says medicine was that killer application. In order to diagnose what a person has, you must logically go, could it be this, could it be that, could it be this, could it be that, and that kind of a thing. So he said it's the origin of logical statements. So we're not going to talk about this very much over here. Atharva Veda and Ayurveda. So basically wanted to show that Indian thinking always existed in cooperation with the philosophy of the land. There was no break between this is science, this is philosophy. Everything was entwined with each other. So how was disease and ill health seen? Disease and ill health was seen due to unwholesome diet, which required Ayurveda to cure. Or if you look at the psychological aspects, due to your karma phala and transgressions. That's why you have a certain condition, maybe mental condition or something else. It required Prayaschita and Atharva Veda practice rituals and other such things to cure. So in other words, it's a very neat understanding of both the physical aspect as well as the mental aspect and these kinds of things. Sushruta, we all know, he wrote Sushruta Samhita, 120 chapters in 5 sections plus 66 later interpolations into this. He discusses a whole lot of subjects, as you can see over here, describes 1120 diseases, describes the human anatomy, how many bones, muscles, veins, and so on, describes surgical methods. I'm not going to read these things. And he also describes 121 surgical instruments. So that is the enormous scientific encoding in this compendium that he did, Sushruta Samhita. Here's an example of the palm leaf Sushruta Samhita. This is from the LA County Museum. It's a 12th century work in Nepal. That's how these works survived. And until such time it was committed down to the modern book and other such things, they were written in palm leaves like this. So here are some of the surgical instruments that is there in Sushruta Samhita. And you can take a look at this and say, whoa, it looks like these look like modern instruments over here. But then this is used by Indians at a very ancient time for all kinds of operations. He also used a cadaver. Today we think that dissection and other things came from the West, and they're the ones from Galen onwards, Roman times. Those are the people who did these things. But if you take a look in Sushruta Samhita, it says, cover a dead body with kusa grass, place it on the edge of the water of a rivulet. After 3 days, take it out and wipe out successive layers of epidermis and dermis of the muscles beneath by gently rubbing it over the soft brush. Thus, the smallest and thinnest arteries, which would have swelled and obtained a distinct extinction, are made palpable everywhere, even to the minutest details. In other words, he said how we can use a dead body to understand the internal working of the organs and things like that. This is there in Sushruta Samhita. Charaka Samhita. So these are all Western timelines over here. So it got its inspiration from Atharva Veda, which went to Punarvashu Atreya, the Bela Samhita, Agnivesa's work, then to Charaka Samhita, then to Dhridbala. This is the citation trial for these works. Once again, 120 chapters and 8 sthanas. I'm not going to read these things. Very, very intricate knowledge of diseases and treatments and how we do various things. Very, very interesting. I'd like to talk to you about Bhova Manuscript. Bhova Manuscript is the earliest extant manuscript that we have of Indian medicine. This was found in Xinjiang province in 1890, birch-bark document, written in Prakrit, Gupta Brahmi script. It seems to be a subset of Charaka Samhita, refers to rishis Atreya, Harita, Parashara, Garga, Sushruta, Vashishta, and accepts the doshas, 3 doshas, Vata, Pitta, Kapha, but also talks Rakta dosha. This was translated by Rudolf Hornell in this particular work, and this is how it appears. So, Rudolf Hornell was a person who dated Sushruta to around 600 BCE. And how did he do that? He basically said the Jataka records that medicine was taught in Takshashila as well as in Kashi. So he places Sushruta to the east at Kashi and Charaka as a physician in the court of King Kanishka and Atreya as a contemporary of Sushruta in Takshila. So one person he places here, other person he places over here. Then he places Yajnavalkya, author of Shatapatha Brahmana, the court of King Janaka of Vaidehi, and is a contemporary of Ajatashatru. Then he uses Weber's work to place Yajnavalkya to 500 BCE. Why is that important? Because he says Shatapatha Brahmana seems to be aware of the bones described in Sushruta and not the bones in Atreya. So based on intricate understanding of the bone structure, he makes certain claims that Shatapatha Brahmana seems to have knowledge of the bones of Sushruta. Because of that, he says, Yajnavalkya is dated to 500 BCE, therefore 100 years before him I'll place Sushruta and give 600 BCE, as arbitrary as that. But we can go and see if there's any other way we can date Shatapatha Brahmana. Shatapatha Brahmana was deciphered in 1893 by both Dikshit as well as Balagangadhar Tilak. We already talked about this. And basically they used Kritika, and they tried to say the Kritika would have a heliacal rising in 2982 BCE. You can't understand this picture over here because this is talking about precision. So 2982 BC, we don't have a pole star. This is our pole star. In the current time, this would be at the center over here, but this is how much in the past we would have moved. So Kritika in 2982 BCE was on the celestial equator. Today it is somewhere over here because of precision. So we know that Shatapatha Brahmana should be dated to 2982 BCE, and because of that, Shatapatha Brahmana that mentions this Kritika phenomenon is in this date. And based upon knowledge of bones, Sushruta and Punarusha Atreya should also be before 2982 BCE and Charaka after this. So bottom line, we are using the same methods of Rudolf Hornell to date Sushruta, and Sushruta's lower bound comes to at least 2982 BCE. So I have a combined section over here for all the knowledge systems to talk about knowledge transfer. So very quickly talk about knowledge transfer. We know that there was ancient climate change approximately in 2000 BCE. If you look at this Nature paper, 2014, 200-year drought doomed the Indus Valley civilization. A genetics paper that says empty DNA from Bronze Age suggests a link between Indian subcontinent and Mesopotamian cradle of civilization. This paper came out just in July of 2019 that says the zebu was found in Mitanni and Hittite lands, and it talks about how there was a migration from the Indus Valley area 4.2 thousand years ago, and that had the presence of zebu cattle in the Mitanni lands. So we know that approximately 4,000 years ago, there was huge migrations out of India to places where water was in the Euphrates, Tigris, and those kind of areas. Isn't it amazing that if you look at Egyptian medicine or Hittites or anything, they don't have any evidence of any knowledge until after 1800 and 1500 BCE. Their earliest medical texts, the Smith Papyrus, Eber's Papyrus, and the Kahun Papyrus, all of these things are only after 1800 BCE. After the migrations have taken place, that is when you see evidence of these. Their contents of magic, trauma, surgery, gynecology, and gynecology, surgery, magic. All these things were contents of Atharva Veda. All of these things were contents of early Ayurvedic works. And these things seem to be injected over here. And there's a book over here that talks about antiquity of Hindu medicine that says plants and materials from India were in use in Egypt. And he hints at knowledge transfer from India. So this is an example of how Indian medical knowledge is transmitted to Egypt in this early time frame. If you look at the Mitannis, Hittites, and Kassites, the Mitannis invoked Indra, Varuna, and Ashwinis in their peace treaties with the Egyptian pharaohs. So when Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep fell ill, the Mitanni king sent a healing statue of Shauka. Shauka is like Durga on a lion. So same thing is sent as a healing statue for him. And there is that evidence out there. Hittites suffered through 20 years smallpox, and they had a deity called Kamru Sepa, who was linked with Varuna. And she's supposed to trap the diseased demon in a bronze spot and save lives. If you're in a place where there's a lot of infection due to smallpox, you're interested in knowing how to be antiseptic, how to have good water. We know that if you store water in a copper pot overnight, it's got some antiseptic properties. So it recounts an idea that trap the diseased demon in a bronze spot and save lives. Very, very interesting. If you look at Babylon Akkadian medical text 1800 BCE, it talks about rational examination, looking familiar, right? Rational examination came from Nyaya and other things, looking on how to diagnose and so on. Logic, therapy, uses exorcism to cure illness due to curses. The Kassite medical letter from Nippur, that also talks about the same thing based on herbal medicine and spells. So very clearly, Mitannis, Hittites, Kassites have been exposed to Ayurveda and Indic knowledge systems. We should not go and see a direct, maybe a clay tablet saying we got it from India. There's no such concept in those days. There's no concept of visa, no concept of foreigners. People come, live, give an idea, and people start using those things. So we see echoes of Indian thought in early periods of time. That is what we are looking for over here. Transmission to the Greeks and Romans, very clear. If you look at Ayurveda, it talks about the doshas, all the doshas over here. Maps very clean to Hippocrates' model of this yellow bile and black bile and phlegm and blood and hot, dry, cold, wet. Maps to this very, very well. So Hippocrates proposed a system, expanded by Galen later. If you see who was Hippocrates, he was a student of Democritus. Democritus was somebody who seems to have intimate knowledge of Vaisheshika Sutra. We had talked about this earlier. Read Subhash Kak's work. You'll find a lot of these kind of things. Also, there were Buddhist transmissions from 5th to 4th century BCE. Indo-Greek contacts from Alexander onwards, 330 BCE. We know, this is a mistake, it's not Alexander's uncle, but we know that Alexander ordered translation of works for Aristotle. We know Library of Alexandria set up in Egypt for transmission of east to west knowledge. All of these things we know were sources how the Greeks could get information like this. J.F. Royal also shows materia medica of Greeks, Romans borrowed from India, and that was a core of the spice trade. We had said that they came to Western India for spices, pepper and these kind of things. What they don't tell you was Western India was the pharmacy of the world. If you think why today Kottakkal Arya Vaidishala and all those places make Shavanaprasha and all these kind of medicines, even in the early days they made medicines that was the drugs for the entire world. So that is a core of these transmissions. This is the places in Western India from where trade would take place, from here going on to Greece and so on. Transmission in the medieval period also we have works. Dioscorides, I think I'm pronouncing it right. He was a physician's 50 to 70 current era. He wrote a 5-volume Materia Medica with large number of Indian herbs, recipe for drugs. This was used for 16 centuries in Europe as a medical manual. Spice, herbs, medicinal drugs, all of these things ended when the Christianization of Rome in 330 current era. As soon as Constantine adopted Christianity as a state religion, the trade with India stopped almost overnight and they went into dark ages. Not only dark ages, they went through illiteracy and they also went through disease. Disease took hold of them. Why? Because they were no longer getting drugs from India. They were no longer getting spices from India. They were no longer getting the materia medica from India to cure their problems. So you see, Europe suffered a lot of diseases after that time frame. The Byzantine emperor, he persecuted the Nestorians and they fled to Kerala. These are the Syrian Christians who started around 500 current era. We are told that they came with St. Thomas. I don't think there's any evidence for that. The evidence says that they were Nestorians who came to India and they were the source of transmission to Syria because they had links with Edessa, the bishop at Edessa, and they had constant links with them all the time. And that formed trade links from all the way from Kerala to Syria. Nestorians and Greeks fled to Jandishapur in Persia in 530 current era, and that was a center for Indian medicine and learning. We know about Anushirwan, who sent his vizier, this Borziu, to India to get medical texts. And this is a picture in today's Tehran courthouse of this king, Anushirwan. Eastward also, we have a lot of information about eastward transmission of Indian medicine. We know Silk Route was used, Buddhist transmission route. The fact that Bhova manuscript was found in the Silk Route in Xinjiang province is an example of how Indian knowledge also was part of trade with the eastern parts and western parts of the world. Ideas of hot and cold, yin, yang, dhyana to zen, all those things are there. Fahian, who came to India, made several observations, similarly Bodhidharma, Shaolin, and Huensang, and Yixing, and others. And we also have a curious poem by somebody called Liu Yuxi, who says a Brahmin priest physician who bestowed eyes. This turns out to be Nagarjuna, who was a Buddhist actually, not a Brahmin, and he practiced cataract surgery from Sushruta Samhita, and he saved Chinese eyes. And she wrote a poem for him, and it survives to the present time that somebody bestowed eyes on them. So very, very amazing. So we know about these transmissions. Transmissions to Muslim lands, we know once Sindh fell to the Muslims, Manka, who went to the court of Harun al-Rashid, translated Sushruta Samhita, used by Ibn Sina, and these medical texts form the foundation of European medicine from 12th century onwards. We know about Al-Tabari, who wrote comparative works of Greek and Indian medicine, and this person, Allah ibn Ali, who translated Charaka Samhita to Persian. And all this knowledge was transmitted into Spain. All these were under Muslim control, from Sindh onwards to Arabia to North Algeria to all these places up to southern Spain. So Indian knowledge was taken and injected over here. And we know about Al-Kindi, who translated many of these things and wrote works on mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and so on. In Toledo, we know that there were Christian monasteries whose only job was to translate from Arabic into Latin. And that formed the basis of many of the European works too. And that's how their corpus of knowledge also built. They used astronomy, they used translations on mathematics, on medicine, and this formed the corpus of their own works for the Renaissance and such things. Colonial period, I'm not even going to read this. A whole lot of people who took Indian knowledge. This person in Goa, he wrote this particular book on Ayurveda, translated to Latin by this particular Clusius. Botanist Hendrik van Reed, he came to Malabar and wrote this with the physician's help. Johann Koenig, he was a pupil of Carl Linnaeus, the very famous botanist. He was a source for Linnaeus' works on botany. He's described about the plants of India and so on. Bartholomew Ziegenberg, who collected many, many Tamil medical works and other such works, 1712. Here's a bibliography of all his works over here, and other people. So medical colleges in India, that was in Pondicherry, Madras, and Kolkata, they were teaching Ayurveda for the longest time because their own medicines did not cover what should be done. Their pharmacology was entirely making drugs out of Ayurvedic preparations. However, all that stopped in the late 1880s or so, after they had digested all of Indian medical knowledge and they had their own chemical processes in making drugs. So after that, the Western education system started. So conclusion from this section is that enormous antiquity for Indian medical knowledge, the roots in Atharva Veda, we talked about Sushruta and Charaka. Ayurvedic medicine was transferred to all parts of the ancient world, Egypt, Babylon, Greece, transferred to West Asia and Europe in medieval and colonial times. After digestion of this knowledge, the practice of Ayurvedic knowledge was discouraged. Today, scientists are rediscovering fundamental truths about body-mind effects for cure. So it's 3:03. I will very quickly talk about roots of music and we will stop after that. So typically when we hear about music, the received wisdom is music arose independently in various parts of the world. In India, in Greece, in China, and all these places, music independently arose. We'd like to examine some of these assertions and see how real is those things. We are told that music is universal language. However, it became a standard. And we had to ask, how is it that it was standardized? If it was universal and arose independently, we would expect variation in the way music is formed, but there's a standard that we see. So some questions: how did similarly spaced scales evolve in Indian and Western music? What accounts for commonality of instruments? We'll do a very, very brief investigation. So Indian music, we know that ancient period from the most ancient times to 12th century, medieval period 13th to 18th century, and the modern period. And there are several things to learn about when we talk about Indian music. Not going to go into all of these things. If you look at Chandogya Upanishad, it talks about division of the octave into 22 parts. 22 parts is something alien to most of us because we know about the 7-tone music, we know about the 12 semitone music, but 22 parts. So basically this is Sa, you have Re, Ga, Ma, Pa, Da, Ni, Sa. This is 7 notes over here. And here you have the semitones, the 12 semitones, and here are the 12 Shrutis. Now, each of these, remember in India, every knowledge system was deeply tied with the philosophy of the land. So music was also associated with divinities and swaras. That is the earliest way music was seen. If you look at the evolution of the scale, in the beginning, Samagana only used 3 notes as Uddata, Anudatta, and Swarita. Later on, it evolved into the 7-tone music that we see here. Now, one important question is, what was the reference for Indian music? In other words, today if you get a musician to do some work for you, he's going to get a pitch pipe. That's what the Europeans use. A pitch pipe will tell you that this is the pitch of the A note, this is the pitch of the C note, pitch of something else. Today you have on your iPhones and phones, you've got a tonal generator that can tell you what the reference tones are. In ancient India, the reference tones were the sounds of these animals over here. So the sound of the heron was this ma, goat was ga, and bull was this re, and so on. So this was the reference notes that was told for Indians, because how do you communicate to somebody from north to the south that this is the sound of sa, this is the sound of re? It could be anything, right? So the reference notes were these things. So the relation between East and West, the 12 Shrutis are mapped to 12 semitones. I've shown this over here. In the European practice, the octaves divided into 12 semitones of exactly the same width. They use the concept of cents. So the entire octave is divided into 1,200 cents, and each division here is 100. C to C sharp is 100, C to D is 200, and so on and so forth. So that is a division of the scales seen in Western music. The tonal relation between Carnatic, Hindustani, and Western, we see that in Carnatic, these are the names, very similar names with slight differences in the Hindustani. Not going to read all these things. And here is the equivalent Western notes associated with these things. These are 12 semitones. Now we come to the interesting aspect. There appears to be transmission from Samaveda to the Greeks. And we see that the oldest form of Samavedic scale was pentatonic gamut, arrived at by quintal tuning. I will not go into great details about this, but in this particular work by this gentleman over here, Fadigon, he says that he talks about Pythagoras, and he says about Pythagoras how he lived at the same time as the Upanishads and the same time about these things. And he talks about Silva Sutras, and he says, by analogy, for the present surmise, the minute study of musical intervals in India took place at the end of the Vedic period. That apart, the bottom line is there seems to be exposure of Pythagoras to not only the Upanishads but also the Silva Sutras. So let's take a look at this. Pythagoras is seen as a father of Western music. So he evolved something called a Pythagorean scale. This Pythagorean scale is as F, C, G, D, A, E, B, derived from circle of fifth. This is a very, very musical terminology where you jump from one note to the fifth note. That will give you from F to C the fifth note is G, fifth note is D, fifth note is A. This way you get the whole thing. Now if you put it in order from C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, you'll get a pattern of the major scale is tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. This is the same as, for example, Shankarabharanam tune in Raga in southern India. The same tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, same pattern over there. So these are the notes in C major and in the sequence interval, like I said over here. So Pythagoras used the ratio of 3:2. What is more important, the number 3 was important for him. We know that in India, the number 3 has got very sacred meanings. He also used the 3:2 ratio. The 3:2 ratio is what gives you the circle of fifths to get the scales and other such things. So by doing that, that various other kinds of music, Ionian and I'm not going to go Lydian and all these things, you get that. So bottom line, from C, you see G is the 3:2 ratio, from C to G. From G to D would be a 3:2 ratio. From D to A would be a 3:2 ratio. That is the bottom line. I know it's very mathematical, but the bottom line is Pythagoras made use of ratios from the chord to do that. So if you look at the 7-note Lydian scale, same as the Kalyani Raga, you can, I'm not going to read all these things, but 3 whole notes, semitone, 2 more whole notes, and final semitone. If you look at the tonal frequencies of the Indian music system and the Western music system, it is very clear to me that these are related. It cannot have been an independent development and getting the same tonal frequency difference from each other. I'm not going to go into great details over here, but it's clear by studying these things, you figure out these. So we talked about Silva Sutras, we talked about how there's a lot of mathematics in Silva Sutras. And from Silva Sutras to Pythagoras. Pythagoras is known for his Pythagorean theorem. He believed in the idea of soul transmigration, what is today known as reincarnation, pure vegetarianism, no meats, beans or wine, and the constant working towards an attainment of bodily purification and purity to be able to interact with the divine, meaning universe. In other words, he's internalized Vedantic ideas greatly. Not only is he a vegetarian, he says your constant goal in life is to attain Brahman. So that is his thinking over here. He saw music as a wholly spiritual, scientific endeavor, which is exactly the same in India. In India, music did not start with Bollywood music. It started with Samaveda hymns. It started over there. That was the first part of music. Started with liturgical. It was holy. So he saw the same thing. So he promoted what became the basic fundamental idea of music theory, that by dividing the length of a string, that's very important, dividing the length of a string, ratios of halves, thirds, quarters, fifths, he can create a musical intervals. Now this is exactly the same as Silva Sutra. Silva Sutra, all of mathematics is a string. They take a string, divide it into ratios and teach how we can do ratios, how we can do mathematics and other such things. So Pythagoras came to India, studied Silva Sutra, studied all this mathematics, studied these ratios, and he seems to have taken exactly the same music into Western notation, and that became the foundation of Western music from there on. Of course, in India, we don't see harmonic music the way there is in the West. Today, you have harmonies over there. We don't see that, but we see a lot of melodic music in India with the raga system and so on. So Pythagoras, not going to read all these things. We already talked about how is a vegetarian, Gurukulam, and transmigration of souls. Interesting connections. Indian music, Silva Sutra, math with strings. Pythagoras used string ratio to define notes. Samaveda started with 3 notes. 3 is sacred for Pythagoras. 3/2 ratio starting with point for scale. He didn't use 1/2. He didn't use that kind of a thing. He used 3/2. That's very, very critical. Samaveda Swara system of 7 notes. Diatonic music of 7 notes. From 22 Shrutis, we get 12 semitones and 7 swaras. From 12 semitones, 7 notes. Swaras are associated with divinities. Music used for Samaveda chants initially. He saw music as holy and spiritual. Even he did not say music is for entertainment. He started as a spiritual endeavor. And we have Saraswati as a patron of learning and music. And he actually erected a statue of Muses outside the library in where he lived, because that was a patron of music and learning. Just like Saraswati was patron for us, the Muses were divinities, female divinities, who were also for learning in Greek, the patron of learning and music. Very, very interesting connections. So, interesting question, which came first? The chicken and egg question. Did scales come first or did musical instruments come first? What came first? So, evolution of musical instruments. We see in Bhimbetka 12,000 years ago, we see evidence of dancing. Take a look at this figure over here. You see drumming and you see all these things. There's already some evidence of music over there. It's mentioned the Rig Veda. Rig Veda's got this nali similar to a flute, and the dundubi, which is a drum, and the veena and other such things are also mentioned. I'm not going to go into detail over here. We have a Natya Shastra compiled by Bharat Muni. We have several stringed instruments, wind instruments, percussion instruments, and instruments that do not require tuning. You see evidence of that in sculptures and so on. The Bansuri flute, which is mentioned Rig Veda, Natya Shastra. There's also a flute in Harappa. Harappa also has got evidence of a flute that is over there. The veena, percussor of string instruments, mentioned in Rig Veda, Atharva Veda, Taittiriya Samhita, Shatapatha, Brahmana, Natya Shastra. So we see an evolution of veena over there. Here's a figurine showing the veena. There's a gentleman in New Delhi, I believe, who's recreating Harappan music by taking Harappan sounds and recreating instruments. For example, this bull, and creating this. His name is Shail Vyas. Look him up, and he's got some very interesting works that he's doing. Nadaswaram. Nadaswaram is an ancient instrument used in southern India, and I believe it could have been an inspiration for the trumpet. It's mentioned in Sangamira Tamil works, as well as in the story of Kannagi in this particular work. Ramanahata, we know, ancestor of violin. I don't even want to say all these things, but there is a book that talks about the antiquity of this, how the Arabs introduced this to the Middle East, and this rebab. This is the rebab in Cairo, and from there it went to Europe and became the violin. So this is the ancient precursor of the violin. Drums, we find rhythm percussion earliest is in China, 5000 BC. We find very closely associated with the Shiva symbolism. And the Western claims are 40,000 BC, the flute was invented in Europe, in harp in Mesopotamia, in trumpet in Egypt, violin in Italy, piano and guitar. 35,000 years ago, there seems to be a bone flute from Germany, and there's some skepticism. Is that a flute or the chewing of bones by bears? That's not very clear. And by looking at this, we can't tell the tonal ratio, what kind of sounds would have come. It could have just been sounds, not tones or scales or any such thing. 8,000 years ago from China, in a grave, they found these bones from this bird. Bird's bones are hollow, remember. So they used the bird bones to make flutes. And he appeared to have a 7-hole, having a rough scale with a modern octave. So that appears to be there in China from 8,000 years ago. I think that if we look at China, that's a good mirror to what could have been in India, because Chinese were strongly influenced by Indians. So if you find it over there, there's a good chance that it could have been influenced by India too. So here's a grave where they found the flutes. In Sumeria, this particular article, she says that the earliest scores are there. Scores are where you communicate your musical information using notes. So she claims that a particular work in cuneiform turned out to be a musical score in the Lydian scale. Egypt, we see evidence of music and dance. And once again, evidence of loot in Egypt, a very ancient period of time. From Greece, 1300 BCE, you find some evidence of the earliest lyre with 7 strings held by a man. We know about the Hemachandra numbers, how it leads rhythm patterns, very recently popularized by Manju Bhargav. Mathematics of music leads to rhythm and scales. So he talks about how the short syllable is 1 beat, long syllable is 2 beats, and the problem of how to fit in a certain number of beats into an 8-note interval and so on. That gave rise to enormous numbers of binary ways of doing these things. So he talks about that. Look at Poetry, Daisies and Cobra by his work. You can see that. Or you might listen to this B.C. Manjunath, who does an amazing performance of this Fibonacci sequence in this conical rhythm pattern. Again, the idea is that in India, mathematics was deeply tied to rhythm with music and other such things. So concluding remarks, roots of music in Samaveda, division of octave, Shruti and Swara is as ancient as Chandogya Upanishad. 3-note to 7-note music evolution via 5-note, examine Pythagorean music. I proposed a study of Sushruta to show evolution of scale in Western music, antiquity of instruments, and showed connection between math, prosody, and rhythm. And this is my big conclusion over here. We talked a lot today. I'm not sure whether I succeeded in communicating or putting you to sleep, but at any rate, Indian civilization arcing back to enormous antiquity, we traced knowledge systems, showed methods of Indian astronomy, antiquity in astronomical measurements, and we talked about some astronomers, antiquity of medical systems, impact on all ancient modern civilizations, root of mathematics in Vedic era, medieval mathematics, transfer to West Asia, Europe. And present-day narratives use faulty, biased methodologies and do not acknowledge Vedic Hindu history or contributions. So that is the grand end of my talk. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.